high-profile meetings have taken place in the last 48 hours, one between US President Joe Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Washington to chalk out the way forward on dealing with Russia amid the Ukraine crisis, and another between Russian President Vladimir Putin and French President Emmanuel Macron in Moscow. While the US and Europe are trying to put on a united front, Macron has presented himself at the center of Europe's furious diplomatic maneuvering over Ukraine. To talk about that, we have with us Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies in JNU. Professor Singh, welcome to DD India. How do you look at the situation as it presently stands? Because a lot of sparks have been flying on both sides. There have been threat of sanctions. We are aware of how arms have been moved in the past, and a lot of rhetoric at the same time.
Thank you, Mohan. I think there are multiple levels of both tensions and diplomatic initiatives, except that in the continuing tensions for the last 3 months, the diplomatic initiatives are showing a little bit of positive outcomes right now. We have had both face-to-face and online meetings of President Joe Biden and President Vladimir Putin. Outcomes of those direct talks were not encouraging. But we can notice now the initiation of diplomacy in Berlin talks of their representatives of 4 countries last week, and I think this Monday's meeting between President Emmanuel Macron and President Vladimir Putin, there are little positive outcomes that one can notice. And one has to also, at second level, understand there is a lot of posturing that is going on. Russia, for example, as you mentioned, has about 110 to 130,000 troops deployed, but constantly also sort of having a refrain of having no intentions of invading Ukraine. We have heard shrill voices from some of the Baltic countries, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Also harsh voices from UK, for example, and tough talk from United States. But Germany, until of course Chancellor Olaf Scholz was this Monday meeting, Joe Biden, the tone was slightly different. Otherwise, the tone was much more restrained. France, particularly, I think, is beginning to take initiative, and President Macron has said that Europe should look for its own independent solution dealing with Russia, because Europe shares a very different kind of relationship with Russia. So there are new indications of certain positive outcomes, and I think I want to also add here, if you notice the kind of messages now coming from President Zelensky and his administration, saying that UK and US perhaps are overestimating and overreacting, and opening that we have seen now of Kiev and Moscow, and particularly between Paris and Moscow now, the willingness to entertain conversation. And of course the offers of at least talking about nuclear deployments, rearranging them, talking of CBMs within OSCE kind of frame. So certain indications that of course also we all understand that when positions are outlined by either Ukraine in terms of not talking to separatists, but they're willing to talk to those two so-called autonomous republics in terms of autonomy, not separation. Russia is also laying out sort of very clearly a draft treaty last year. They had laid out saying Ukraine should never join NATO, deployment should be removed from East European countries by NATO. So some of these are also bargaining positions. And let me quickly add the fact that we are making a sort of lot of speculations about 2,700 soldiers being transferred from US to Europe. These are purely symbolic. US has about 70,000 permanent troops deployed across Europe, we must understand. And these are small insinuations kind of showcasing that kind of positioning of strength in that sense. Otherwise, I think the fundamental limitation of Joe Biden today is the divided house in NATO. NATO is not speaking in one voice, and Macron has clearly shown that his line of engaging Russia is clearly different than that of United States. So I think fundamentally a lot of the multiple pulls and pressures and multiple points of tensions, but I think last week and this week particularly has begun with certain kinds of positive outcomes and positive indications that multiple sides, whether it is Paris, Berlin, Kiev or Moscow, at least they are willing to have a conversation. And that is a good opening. Of course, even after talks, they have different interpretations of what has transpired in these conversations.
Yes.
But the fact that conversations are taking place is a good sign.
Fair enough. We heard from Joe Biden, who said that if Russia were to attack Ukraine, then the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Germany and Russia will not go ahead. Are Germany and the US on the same page? And also tell us about what can we understand as far as West so-called unity on the Ukraine crisis is concerned. Are there serious cracks in this unity still?
I think we have noticed these multiple cracks in those 30 nations at NATO alliance, and how UK and US have perhaps far more sharper line that they have taken. And in that sense, they are looking at as kind of Cold War contestation between Russia and United States and its close allies. But Germany, for example, has invested about $11 billion on that Nord Stream 2, and that is supposed to double gas consumption of Germany from Russia. So in that sense, that is a very integral kind of a project which both Russia and Germany would like to ensure that it reaches its natural conclusion, and it's going on for several years. And it in fact was held back primarily because it was not reaching the standards that Germans were prescribing. But I think I saw that Chancellor Scholz stayed silent when this kind of strong statement was made in the press conference in Washington DC by Joe Biden, saying that he will make sure, by whatever means that Nord Stream 2 doesn't work. In case, look at the language, in case Russia invades Ukraine. Now, was Crimea an invasion, if you remember? It is a piecemeal covert operations, gradually not claiming these are our soldiers. So there's not going to be a clear-cut invasion of Ukraine. So very carefully calibrating the language in case Russia was to invade Ukraine, again is posturing fundamentally. And Germany in that sense also enormously, they have sort of cut down on their nuclear power generation, increased their dependence on gas from Russia. So these are economic intertwining of Russia that has happened with Western Europe. So also France has kind of built enormous strong relationship with Russia. So many countries indeed, not just Ukraine and Germany. These are, in Europe we say that three big countries are UK, France and Germany. UK right now is standing with US, but France, and to a great extent not so openly, but Germany also is kind of showcasing that it has a independent different stand on Russia and how to resolve these crises. So NATO's not being a clearly united kind of a body is clearly visible. Baltic states are another group of countries making a lot of noise because they were part of Soviet Union. They decided not to be part of CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization later, but join NATO instead. But these are states where you have 500, 600, 800 soldiers of NATO deployed there, primarily for purposes of training and other things. No doubt Europe is enormously infested with the armed forces, facing on Russia and its CSTO friends on one side and NATO on the other, but I don't see them willing or even to some extent capable of ratcheting up and fighting an actual war. An actual war is not going to happen. At best, another statement that one has just heard is the former security minister of Ukraine now, who leads one of the militant outfits in Donetsk People's Republic. There are two, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. They have declared themselves such in eastern Ukraine. He's just given out a call to Reuters actually, saying that he's requesting Russia to give 30,000 troops because he is suspecting that so much of sort of deployment of Ukraine forces to the east, and this is about 30 kilometers buffer where these two independent republics exist. So he's saying that they are under threat. So he's requesting President Putin to give him about 30,000 troops fully equipped with ammunition and arms. So there are multiple kind of pressure points that are being perhaps used in very calibrated fashion. But the broader canvas shows, I think there's a little shift in beginning to talk to each other. And these pressure points will be used in those conversations, but conversations are good.
Fair enough. Professor Singh, has the crisis given an opportunity to the United States to reassert its Atlantic power credentials that had taken a backseat during the Trump regime and given scope to Russia to reassert itself in Europe?
And there is no doubt, I think that Trump 4 years have done enormous damage in terms of the unity of NATO because of his very personalized, very condescending, sometimes very harsh usage of language. And definitely when Joe Biden came back, he wanted to shift foreign policy in general and engagement with allies to far more subtle, imperceptible, under the banner of America is back. But he's got into crisis one after another, first in Afghanistan and now in Ukraine. So I think the healing time has not been enough to sort of bring NATO alliance together. Though there was some indications of him engaging these leaders individually and multilaterally to sort of redefine the equation between the United States and NATO allies in Europe. But Ukraine crisis indeed might also make him see that it's not going to be the same NATO as it was before, because Russia's engagements and economic partnerships with several European countries are very different today. And of course, to some extent, I would even dare say that the fact that NATO is almost trying to reach out to Russian borders by co-opting Ukraine, it goes back to 2008 when George Bush Jr. had for the first time formally proposed at NATO summit to have Ukraine as a member. Of course, at that time also Germany and France had made sure this is kind of delayed and it's not kind of immediately implemented. So US perhaps will have lessons to learn here as to how to reorganize both its expectations from NATO and the equation with NATO, and how far to push NATO in terms of constantly expanding eastwards. It's about 600 miles they've already expanded eastwards. They are hitting on Russia's borders. So to some extent, I'm not saying Russia is doing all fine. They have also, the way they have kind of captured Crimea, there are questions on that. What they are doing in eastern Ukraine is also questionable. But pushing Russia all the way to the wall, I think this is where Russia has now reacted and is willing to find a long-term solution of NATO, no longer pushing Russia constantly and sort of engulfing it with the immediate neighbors also becoming members of NATO, which would lead to deployments of NATO forces and sort of dangerous weapons in those areas. So some of the security concerns of Russia are understandable. Maybe their techniques may not be very agreeable at this stage. So I think it's an important time when NATO will have to really redefine what it wants to continue doing, and also for US to learn lessons of how to reorganize its equations with NATO, and also how to lead NATO and perhaps give a little more space to some of these important countries in Europe like Germany and France, who are otherwise willing to show that they're not really on the same page as far as United States take on dealing with Russia is concerned.
And how do you see Emmanuel Macron's emergence as a central figure in Europe's hectic diplomacy with Russia over Ukraine?
I'm not sure if this is a very, very good thing to say, but in that sense, it's a great opportunity for President Macron because Olaf Scholz has just taken over from very long tenure of Chancellor Angela Merkel. And in UK, we see Prime Minister Johnson is already engulfed with multiple internal situations at home. So that gives a little space to President Macron to appear to be taking initiative, and he's gone to the extent of saying Europe should look for its own solutions in dealing with Russia. And now he's this shuttle diplomacy. He was day before in Moscow talking about 5 hours with President Putin. He's now in Kyiv talking to President Zelensky. In that case, I think he's showcasing that there is a space for European leaders, and in this case particularly, this moment is perhaps very, very favorable to French President to showcase his taking initiative and moving forward diplomatic sort of solutions to this very serious crisis. So definitely, I think he comes out as a very noticeable sort of interlocutor, intervening to find a resolution using diplomacy. And I think this is time that United States should also begin to sort of tone down and begin to think of what to do with the draft treaty that Russia had proposed last year, and how it can also perhaps showcase that there are other sort of opportunities of engagement also there, and not just hardcore military solution pursuing in terms of threatening kind of language that is being used. Even if language is repeatedly restricted, two things are very important from US. One, repeatedly mention of in case of Russian invasion, and repeated mentions of severe and unbearable sanctions, not really talking in terms of military action. but restricting it repeatedly to sanctions. But in that case, how do you begin dialogue? I think is something that needs to be now come from the United States, because that greatly matters. Even if Macron is talking to President Putin, but certain beginning of a dialogue with the United States is what going to greatly make the difference on the ground as well as the tensions on the Ukraine border are concerned.
We are aware that economics is a key imponderable in geopolitics, and would you say that a similar sort of a priority is involved here as well, because we are aware, like I had said before, that Europe is dependent a lot on the gas supplies from Russia, and the United States is trying to ensure that some of the gas supplies come from Qatar. However, one is not sure whether the gas supplies that come in from the Gulf would be adequate for even Germany for that matter, and then there would be repercussions for India if Gulf were to supply a lot of gas to the European countries. So how does one navigate this?
I think India definitely comes in as a country which will have an impact on these crises continuing in future, whether it is international market becoming volatile in terms of energy supplies of gas and oil, or it is India being forced to choose sides between Moscow and Washington, or all sorts of other instability in Europe would have an impact on India as well, because their intentions and their capabilities and their focus on dealing with some of the other issues like terrorism, climate change would get deflected, and they have direct impact on India. India's neighborhood is now under enormous tensions. You see, world media is no longer talking of what is happening in Afghanistan, which is in India's neighborhood with direct implications. So I agree with you that United States dependence on Russian gas and oil obviously is not there, but Europe now enormously depends on Russian gas and oil supplies, and indeed Russian economy also requires purchase of gas by Europeans, and in the potential investments into these sectors by European countries. That kind of strong intertwining of relationship becomes particularly significant when all these countries are looking for post-pandemic resilience and revival of their economies. And therefore, both Russia and European nations today think that any kind of development and resilience and growth rates they want to achieve are enormously dependent on energy. And energy is something that today binds European nations, particularly major European nations like Germany and France to Russia, and therefore this mutual interdependence is something that is something that defines how European nations are looking at how far to push Russia on Ukraine compared to the language that is coming from the United States. But United States economy also, remember, is closely intertwined with European economies. So in that sense, there is a limit as to how far even United States can continue to ratchet up this rhetoric of pushing President Putin to fall in line and accept the terms that US would like to offer. There has to be some kind of a mutual understanding on both sides, and basically it has to be dialogue between ideally speaking President Joe Biden and President Putin, or at some other level of Mr. Lavrov and Antony Blinken, for example. But there is no doubt this whole crisis have shown us very clearly how Europe behaves differently, primarily driven by economic parameters and its intertwining with Russian economy and gas and oil.
Thank you for your insights, Professor Singh, on the Ukraine-Russia West crisis.